Welcome to Words to Live By, a podcast series hosted by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Each week, we will share some of the wit and wisdom of Ronald Reagan. In essence, Words to Live By, made up of radio addresses and speeches he delivered from the 1960s through the 1980s. Okay, time for a little quiz. So when I say August 1984 and Ronald Reagan, what comes to mind? Answer, his acceptance of the presidential nomination, of course. It's important to remember that the president regarded the 1984 election as pivotal because he believed the gains he had made during the first 4 years were in jeopardy. He wanted to preserve what he had accomplished, and there were still things he wanted to do. What were those two things? You guessed it, cutting the deficit and balancing the budget. Although an economic expansion was well underway, he thought he could do more to stimulate the economy by making our tax system fairer and simpler. Our ever-optimistic 40th president believed he could persuade Congress to cut more waste out of the budget and continue the process of making government smaller and less intrusive. So, for this week's podcast, we'll walk down memory lane with the president to hear his remarks when accepting the nomination in 1984 in Dallas, Texas. He'll define his objectives and deliver his thoughts on his opponent, Walter Mondale. You'll also hear the president refer to San Francisco, and that's because that's where the Democrats held their convention in July of 1984. Let's listen.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice President, delegates to this convention, and fellow citizens. 75 days, I hope we enjoy a victory that is the size of the heart of Texas. Nancy and I extend our deep thanks to the Lone Star State and the Big D, the city of Dallas, for all their warmth and hospitality. 4 years ago, I didn't know precisely every duty of this office, and not too long ago, I learned about some new ones from the first graders of Corpus Christi School in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Little Leah Klein was asked by her teacher to describe my duties. She said, the president goes to meetings, he helps the animals, the president gets frustrated, he talks to other presidents. How does wisdom begin at such an early age? Tonight, with a full heart and deep gratitude for your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States. I will campaign on behalf of the principles of our party which lift America confidently into the future. America is presented with the clearest political choice of half a century. The distinction between our two parties and the different philosophy of our political opponents are at the heart of this campaign and America's future. I've been campaigning long enough to know that a political party and its leadership can't change their colors in 4 days. We won't, and no matter how hard they tried, our opponents didn't in San Francisco. We didn't discover our values in a poll taken a week before the convention. we didn't set a weather vane on top of the Golden Gate Bridge before we started talking about the American family. The choices this year are not just between two different personalities or between two political parties. They're between two different visions of the future, two fundamentally different ways of governing. Their government of pessimism, fear, and limits, or ours of hope, confidence, and growth. Their government sees people only as members of groups. Ours serves all the people of America as individuals. Theirs lives in the past, seeking to apply the old and failed policies to an era that has passed them by. Ours learns from the past and strives to change by boldly charting a new course for the future. Theirs lives by promises. The bigger, the better. We offer proven, workable answers. Our opponents began this campaign hoping that America has a poor memory. Well, let's take them on a little stroll down memory lane. Let's remind them of how a 4.8% inflation rate in 1976 became back-to-back years of double-digit inflation, the worst since World War I. Punishing the poor and the elderly, young couples striving to start their new lives, and working people struggling to make ends meet. Inflation was not some plague born on the wind. It was a deliberate part of their official economic policy, needed, they said, to maintain prosperity. They didn't tell us that with it would come the highest interest rates since the Civil War. As average monthly mortgage payments more than doubled, home building nearly ground to a halt. Tens of thousands of carpenters and others were thrown out of work. And who controlled both houses of the Congress and the executive branch at that time? Not us. Not us. Campaigning across America in 1980, we saw evidence everywhere of industrial decline. And in rural America, farmers' costs were driven up by inflation. They were devastated by wrong-headed grain embargo and were forced to borrow money at exorbitant interest rates just to get by, and many of them didn't get by. Farmers have to fight insects, weather, and the marketplace. They shouldn't have to fight their own government. The high interest rates of 1980 were not talked about in San Francisco. But how about taxes? They were talked about in San Francisco. Will Rogers once said he never met a man he didn't like. Well, if I could paraphrase Will, our friends in the other party have never met a tax they didn't like. They didn't like or hike. Under their policies, tax rates have gone up 3 times as much for families with children as they have for everyone else over these past 3 decades. In just the 5 years before we came into office, taxes roughly doubled. In 1980, the people decided with us that the economic crisis was not caused by the fact that they lived too well. Government lived too well. It was time for tax increases to be an act of last resort, not of first resort. The people told the liberal leadership in Washington, try shrinking the size of government before you shrink the size of our paychecks. Our government was also in serious trouble abroad. We had aircraft that couldn't fly and ships that couldn't leave port. Many of our military were on food stamps because of meager earnings, and re-enlistments were down. Ammunition was low, and spare parts were in short supply. Many of our allies mistrusted us. In the 4 years before we took office, country after country fell under the Soviet yoke. Since January 20th, 1981, not 1 inch of soil has fallen to the communists. But worst of all, Americans were losing the confidence and optimism about the future that has made us unique in the world. Parents were beginning to doubt that their children would have the better life that has been the dream of every American generation. We can all be proud that pessimism is ended. America is coming back and is more confident than ever about the future. Tonight, we thank the citizens of the United States whose faith and unwillingness to give up on themselves or this country saved us all.
More highlights from this dynamic acceptance speech right after this brief message. We'll be right back.
The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation is the nonprofit organization created by President Reagan himself, and specifically charged by him with continuing his legacy and sharing his principles: individual liberty, economic opportunity, global democracy, and national pride. We must remain vigilant and work together to share these conservative principles with younger generations. Your role is critical to move our mission forward. Thank you for your continued support. Please visit reaganfoundation.org/give. That's reaganfoundation.org/give.
Now, back to the story. Eventually, the president segues to one of his favorite themes, peace through strength. Let's listen.
Now, we're accused of having a secret. Well, if we have, it is that we're going to keep the mighty engine of this nation revved up, and that means a future of sustained economic growth without inflation that's going to create for our children and grandchildren a prosperity that finally will last. Today our troops have newer and better equipment. Their morale is higher. The better armed they are, the less likely it is they will have to use that equipment. But if, for heaven forbid, they're ever called upon to defend this nation, nothing would be more immoral than asking them to do so with weapons inferior to those of any possible opponent. None of the 4 wars in my lifetime came about because we were too strong. It is weakness. It is weakness that invites adventurous adversaries to make mistaken judgments. America is the most peaceful, least warlike nation in modern history. We are not the cause of all the ills of the world. We're a patient and generous people. But for the sake of our freedom and that of others, we cannot permit our reserve to be confused with a lack of resolve.
Then, the president shifted his focus to his opponent, Vice President Walter Mondale, whom he called another classic tax and spend liberal from the new school of the Democratic Party, the one that had parted company with its founders, Thomas Jefferson and his friends, who believed that the least government was the best government, and that governments are not the masters of the people, but the servants of the people governed. By 1984, the Democratic Party, according to the president, had become the party of big promises, big government, and big taxes. Yep, the bigger, the better. Let's listen.
Now, their candidate, it would appear, has only recently found deficits alarming. Nearly 10 years ago, he insisted that a $52 billion deficit should be allowed to get much bigger in order to lower unemployment. And he said that sometimes, quote, we need a deficit in order to stimulate the economy. As senator, he voted to override President Ford's veto of billions of dollars in spending bills, and then voted no on a proposal to cut the 1976 deficit in half. Was anyone surprised by his pledge to raise your taxes next year if given a chance? In the Senate, he voted time and again for new taxes, including a 10% income tax surcharge, higher taxes on certain consumer items. He also voted against cutting the excise tax on automobiles. And he was part and parcel of that biggest single individual tax increase in history, the Social Security payroll tax of 1977. It tripled the maximum tax and still didn't make the system solvent. We are committed to stopping them. And we will. They call their policy the new realism, but their new realism is just the old liberalism. They will place higher and higher taxes on small businesses, on family farms, and on every working family, so that government may once again grow at the people's expense. You know, we could say they spend like drunken sailors, but that would be unfair to drunken sailors. To say it would be unfair because the sailors are spending their own money. Our tax policies are and will remain pro-work, pro-growth, and pro-family. We intend to simplify the entire tax system to make taxes more fair, easier to understand, and most important, to bring the tax rates of every American further down, not up. Now, if we bring them down far enough, growth will continue strong, the underground economy will shrink, the world will beat a path to our door, and no one will be able to hold America back, and the future will be ours.
After quite a bit of cheering from the audience, the president shared his thoughts on the Olympics, which had just taken place in Los Angeles. Let's listen.
We cheered in Los Angeles as the flame was carried in, and the giant Olympic torch burst into a billowing fire in front of the teams, the youth of 140 nations assembled on the floor of the Coliseum. And in that moment, maybe you were struck, as I was, with the uniqueness of what was taking place before 100,000 people in the stadium, most of them citizens of our country, and over 1 billion worldwide watching on television. There were athletes representing 140 countries here to compete in the one country in all the world whose people carry the bloodlines of all those 140 countries and more. Only in the United States is there such a rich mixture of races, creeds, and nationalities. Only in our melting pot. And that brings to mind another torch, the one that greeted so many of our parents and grandparents. Just this past 4th of July, the torch atop the Statue of Liberty was hoisted down for replacement. We can be forgiven for thinking that maybe it was just worn out from lighting the way to freedom for 17 million new Americans. So now we'll put up a new one. The poet called Miss Liberty's torch the lamp beside the golden door. Well, that was the entrance to America, and it still is. And now you really know why we're here tonight. The glistening hope of that lamp is still ours. Every promise, every opportunity is still golden in this land. And through that golden door, our children can walk into tomorrow with the knowledge that no one can be denied the promise that is America. Her heart is full, her door is still golden, her future bright. She has arms big enough to comfort and strong enough to support. For the strength in her arms is the strength of her people. She will carry on in the 80s unafraid, unashamed, and unsurpassed. In this springtime of hope, some lights seem eternal. America's is. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless America.
Thank you for listening. For more information on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, including information on how to become a member, information on upcoming exhibits at the Reagan Library, and more information on the legacy of President Reagan, please visit reaganfoundation.org. And don't forget to like and follow the Reagan Foundation on all social media platforms.
Don't forget to subscribe to the Words to Live By podcast in your iTunes or Google Play stores, and on other podcast platforms as they become available. New episodes of Words to Live By come out every Tuesday. Like what you hear? Check out our A Reagan Forum podcast, featuring great speeches delivered at the Reagan Library. New episodes drop every Thursday. And don't forget to follow @Ronald Reagan on Facebook, @Ronald Reagan 40 on Twitter, and Reagan Foundation on YouTube. Also, search for us on SoundCloud and Stitcher.